For 741 days, Marcus Delane slept on a strip of cardboard wedged between a concrete pylon and a chain-link fence beneath the Ridgemont Overpass on the east side of Cedar Falls, Iowa. He had a system: a rolled-up sleeping bag he kept inside 2 garbage bags to protect it from rain, a duffel with 3 changes of clothes that he washed every Tuesday at the laundromat on Birch Street if he had the $2.75, and a tin coffee can where he kept the few things that still mattered to him: his military ID, a photograph of a woman holding a baby in front of a yellow house, and a bronze star with a V device for valor that he hadn't looked at in over a year. Every morning at 6:47, a woman in a dark green coat crossed the bridge above him on her way to work. He knew the sound of her shoes, a sharp, purposeful click against the asphalt that was different from every other set of footsteps. He had memorized her rhythm the way soldiers memorize terrain. She never looked down. She never slowed. She was a metronome of normalcy passing over the wreckage of his life, and for 2 years, that was all she was. Until the morning of November 14th, when the temperature dropped to 9 degrees and she stopped walking. She looked over the railing. She saw him. And what happened next didn't just change Marcus Delane's life. It unraveled a knot of silence and shame and buried grief that had been tightening around 2 families for longer than either of them knew. Marcus James Delane was born on March 3, 1979, in a 3-bedroom house on Caldwell Road in a town called Harlan, about 200 miles southwest of where he would one day sleep under a bridge. His father, James Delane, was a mechanic who ran a 2-bay garage on the edge of town, and his mother, Ruth, was a school cafeteria worker who smelled like industrial soap and cinnamon rolls every day when she came home at 3:15. They were not wealthy people. The house had drafty windows that James stuffed with towels in winter, and Ruth cut coupons from the Harlan Tribune every Sunday with a pair of scissors so dull they bent the paper rather than slicing it. But the house was warm in the ways that mattered. Ruth cooked every night: meatloaf on Mondays, chicken on Wednesdays, fish sticks on Fridays, because she said variety was a form of respect for the people you fed. James taught Marcus how to change oil before the boy could ride a bike, and on Saturday mornings, the 2 of them would lie under whatever vehicle was in the garage, James pointing out parts and Marcus repeating their names like a catechism: alternator, distributor cap, timing belt, catalytic converter. The garage smelled like grease and rust and the particular metallic sweetness of brake fluid, and for the rest of his life, Marcus Delane would associate that smell with safety. Ruth had a garden in the backyard: tomatoes, zucchini, snap peas, and a row of marigolds she planted every spring because she said they kept the bugs away, though James told Marcus privately that the marigolds had never kept a single bug away from anything, and Ruth just liked the color. It was the kind of childhood that people don't realize is extraordinary until it's gone. Ordinary love, ordinary dinners, a father who showed up, and a mother who paid attention. Marcus was a quiet kid, not shy exactly, but interior. He watched more than he spoke. He drew pictures in the margins of his notebooks: tanks and helicopters and soldiers, always soldiers. And when his teacher, Mrs. Phelps, asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up, he said a soldier. And he meant it the way some kids mean astronaut or president, except that Marcus never changed his answer. Not in 5th grade, not in 8th, not when he was 17, and his mother sat him down at the kitchen table with tears already forming in her eyes and asked him if he was sure. He was sure. James drove him to the recruiting office in Des Moines on a Tuesday in June of 1997. Marcus was 18 years old, 6'1", 174 pounds, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's square jaw, and he signed his name on the line with a pen the recruiter gave him that said Army Strong on the side. Ruth cried the entire drive home. James didn't cry, but he didn't speak either, and his silence was louder than Ruth's tears. They stood in the driveway when they got back, the 3 of them, and James put his hand on the back of Marcus's neck the way he did when Marcus was small, and he said, "You come home. That's the only order I'm giving you. You come home." Marcus shipped out to Fort Benning 8 days later. He came home on leave twice that first year, then once the next, then not at all for 14 months when his unit deployed to Kosovo, and then twice more before the towers fell on a September morning, and everything, every single thing about what it meant to be a soldier named Marcus Delane changed. He deployed to Afghanistan in January 2002 with the 10th Mountain Division. He was 22 years old. He had been in the army for 4.5 years, and he was good at it. Not flashy, not the loudest voice in the barracks, but reliable in the way that matters, when reliability is the difference between people living and people dying. His sergeant, a man named Cofield, who had a scar across his left eyebrow and never raised his voice, told Marcus once that he was the kind of soldier you wanted on your six, because he never stopped paying attention. Marcus took that as the highest compliment he had ever received. Afghanistan was nothing like Kosovo. Kosovo had been tense and uncertain, but ultimately structured. Checkpoints, patrols, rules of engagement that mostly held. Afghanistan was chaos dressed up in dust. The mountains were beautiful in a way that felt hostile, as if the landscape itself resented their presence. And the air at altitude was so thin that Marcus's lungs burned for the first 3 weeks. He adapted. He always adapted. That was his gift, and eventually his curse. The ability to adjust to anything, to metabolize horror and keep functioning, to watch a friend bleed out in a ditch outside Gardas and still eat dinner that night because the body requires fuel, whether or not the mind has processed what it saw. He did 2 tours in Afghanistan, the first from January 2002 to February 2003, the second from September 2004 to September 2005. During the second tour, on a patrol through a village in Paktia province, his convoy was hit by an IED that flipped the vehicle in front of his and killed the driver instantly. Marcus pulled 2 men from the wreckage while taking small arms fire from a tree line 200 meters to the east. One of the men he pulled out, a specialist named Devin Torres, was 20 years old and had a photograph of his baby daughter taped inside his helmet. Torres lost his left leg below the knee. The other man, a private named Gilroy, died in Marcus's arms 40 minutes later because the medevac couldn't land in the hot zone. Marcus held him and talked to him, told him about his father's garage, about the smell of brake fluid, about the marigolds that didn't keep bugs away. And Gilroy's eyes went glassy and then empty, and Marcus set him down on the ground and picked up his rifle and kept fighting, because that is what soldiers do. They gave him the Bronze Star for that. He put it in a box and didn't look at it. When he came home in September 2005, he was 26 years old, and he was not the same person who had left. The Army had a term for what was wrong with him: post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, 4 letters that were supposed to contain the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the way he couldn't sit in a restaurant without his back to the wall, the way the sound of a car backfiring sent him to the floor, the way he sometimes woke up screaming Gilroy's name and couldn't stop shaking for 20 minutes. Ruth noticed immediately. She saw it in the way he held his fork, too tight, his knuckles white, as if the fork might be taken from him. She saw it in the way he scanned every room when he entered, mapping exits, identifying threats, never fully sitting down even when he was sitting. James noticed too, but James was a man of his generation and his geography, and he didn't know what to do with a son who flinched at thunder. He tried. He brought Marcus to the garage, put him under a car, handed him a wrench, and said, "Let's work." And for a while that helped. The smell of brake fluid, the solidity of metal, the solvable nature of mechanical problems. This part connects to that part. This bolt holds this bracket. Cause and effect in a world where cause and effect had stopped making sense. Marcus worked in the garage for 3 months. He didn't talk about Afghanistan. Ruth asked once, gently, sitting on the edge of his bed the way she had when he was 8. And Marcus looked at her with eyes that were so flat and distant that she physically recoiled. "Don't ask me, Mom," he said. "Please don't ask me." She never asked again, and that was the beginning of the silence that would eventually swallow him whole. He met a woman named Janelle Porter at a gas station in Harlan on a freezing January evening in 2006. She was 23, a nursing student at Iowa Western Community College. With dark hair she wore in a braid, and a laugh that sounded like it came from somewhere deeper than her throat. A real laugh, full-bodied and unself-conscious. She was filling up a dented Honda Civic, and the pump wouldn't take her card, and she was standing there in the cold, jabbing at the buttons with increasing frustration, when Marcus walked over and said, "You have to press the green one twice." She looked at him. He looked at her. And something happened that Marcus would later describe to himself, in the privacy of his own mind, as the first time since Afghanistan that he felt like a person instead of a perimeter. They started dating. Janelle was not a fragile woman. She had grown up in Council Bluffs with a single mother who worked double shifts at a packaging plant, and she had put herself through school by working as a home health aide for elderly patients, which meant she had seen bodies fail and minds deteriorate, and she was not easily frightened by human suffering. When Marcus woke up screaming, she didn't panic. She put her hand on his chest and said his name. "Marcus, Marcus, you're here, you're home," and waited until his breathing slowed. She was the first person who made him feel like his damage was not the most interesting thing about him. They were married in October 2006 in a small ceremony at the Shelby County Courthouse. Ruth wore a blue dress and cried. James shook Marcus's hand and then pulled him into a hug that lasted 11 seconds, which was 10 seconds longer than any hug James Delane had ever given anyone. Janelle moved into the house on Caldwell Road because Marcus couldn't afford a place of his own, and James said there was no reason to pay rent when there were empty rooms upstairs. For a while, it worked. Marcus helped in the garage. Janelle studied for her boards. Ruth cooked dinner for 4 instead of 3, and set the table with the good plates because she said a daughter-in-law deserved the good plates. In March 2007, Janelle told Marcus she was pregnant. He sat on the porch steps and didn't speak for a long time, and when she came out and sat beside him and asked if he was okay, he said, "I don't know if I know how to be a father." She put her hand on his knee and said, "You know how to protect people. That's most of it." Their daughter, Lily, was born on November 9th, 2007, at Murtu Medical Center, 6 pounds 14 ounces, with her mother's dark hair and her father's watchful eyes. Marcus held her in the delivery room and felt something crack open inside him, not painfully, but like ice breaking on a river in spring, a release of something that had been frozen solid for years. He looked at Janelle and said, "I'm going to give her everything." He meant it. He meant it the way only a man who has seen the worst of the world can mean it, with the desperate, almost violent tenderness of someone who understands exactly how much there is to protect against. For 2 years, things held together the way a house holds together when the foundation has a crack that hasn't reached the walls yet. Standing, functional, showing no visible signs of the catastrophe forming underneath. Marcus worked. He took a job at a farm equipment dealership in Defiance, 20 miles from Harlan, selling parts and occasionally doing repairs in the service bay. He was good with customers in the way that quiet, competent people are good with customers. He listened, he remembered what they needed. He didn't oversell. His boss, a man named Garland, told him he was the best parts guy they'd had in 15 years. Marcus drove to work at 6:30 every morning and came home at 5:15 every evening and kissed Lily's forehead and ate dinner and helped Janelle with her clinical paperwork and went to bed and lay in the dark, listening to the house settle and tried not to think about Gilroy dying in his arms. But the crack was growing. He started drinking, not dramatically, not falling down drunk, but steadily, methodically, the way a man drinks when he's trying to lower the volume on a sound that never stops. 2 beers after dinner became 4. 4 became 6. 6 became a bottle of Jim Beam that he kept in the garage, hidden behind a stack of oil filters on the top shelf where Janelle wouldn't see it. Except Janelle was a nurse. She was trained to notice what people tried to hide. She smelled it on him. She found the bottles, plural now because one wasn't enough. She confronted him in their bedroom one night in April 2009, Lily asleep in the next room, and she didn't yell. Janelle never yelled. She spoke in a voice that was low and steady, and somehow worse than yelling because it carried the weight of clinical certainty. "You're self-medicating," she said. "You need help. Not from me. Not from a bottle. Professional help." Marcus said he was fine. He said it was just a couple of drinks. He said she was overreacting. He used every deflection that every person who has ever been confronted about their drinking has ever used. And Janelle stood there and let him finish and then said, "I've heard every one of those sentences before. I heard them from my patients' families. I heard them from my mother's boyfriend before he put her in the hospital. I'm not going to raise Lily in a house where I'm waiting for something to break. Get help or I will take her and leave." She said it without anger. That was what made it devastating. She said it the way you state a medical fact. Blood pressure is elevated, the fracture requires surgery, the drinking will destroy this family. Marcus said he would get help. He didn't. He said it again in June. He didn't. He said it again in September, and this time, he actually went to the VA in Omaha, sat in the waiting room for 2 hours and 40 minutes, and left before his name was called because the fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic and the sound of a door slamming down the hall sent him into a panic attack so severe he thought he was having a heart attack. He sat in the parking lot for 30 minutes with his hands shaking on the steering wheel, and then he drove home and poured a drink and didn't tell Janelle he had gone. The drinking got worse. He started missing work, not often, but enough that Garland noticed. He snapped at Lily once, a sharp bark of a command when she dropped a glass in the kitchen, and the sound of his own voice, the sergeant's voice, the combat voice, horrified him so completely that he went to the garage and sat on the concrete floor and shook for an hour. Lily was 2 years old. She didn't understand why her father's eyes went empty sometimes, why he sat in the dark, why her mother cried in the bathroom with the water running. Janelle kept her promise. She waited until March 2010, when Marcus came home at 2 a.m., smelling like bourbon, and couldn't tell her where he'd been, and she packed 2 suitcases and put Lily in the car seat and drove to her mother's house in Council Bluffs and didn't come back. She left a note on the kitchen table. 4 sentences. I love you. I can't save you. You have to save yourself. When you're ready, call me. Marcus read the note 7 times. Then he poured a drink. What followed was a descent so gradual and so complete that it almost defied comprehension. Not a fall off a cliff, but a slow walk into deep water, each step taking him further from shore, while the shore itself seemed to stay the same distance away, always visible, always unreachable. He lost the job at the dealership in May 2010. Garland let him go with genuine sadness, said he wished things were different, gave him 2 weeks severance and the name of a treatment center in Sioux City that Marcus put in his wallet and never called. James and Ruth watched their son disintegrate and didn't know what to do. James tried the garage again, the wrench, the car, the solvable problem. But Marcus couldn't hold a wrench steady anymore. His hands shook, his concentration fractured. He would start a task and then stand motionless for 10 minutes, staring at nothing. And James would find him like that and feel something in his own chest that he had no language for. A helplessness so total it was almost physical, as if someone had removed a structural element from inside him and he was still standing only through habit. Ruth called the VA. She called the county mental health office. She called a veterans service organization in Des Moines. She was put on hold, transferred, given numbers that led to other numbers that led to voicemails that were never returned. She left messages. She filled out forms. She drove Marcus to an appointment at a clinic in Council Bluffs and sat in the car for 3 hours while he was inside. And when he came out, he had a prescription for medication he would take for 11 days before stopping because he said it made him feel like he was underwater. James got sick in the fall of 2010. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed late because James was a man who didn't go to doctors until things were undeniable. And by the time he went, the cancer had spread to his liver. He died on February 2nd, 2011, in the bedroom where he had slept for 34 years. Marcus was sober for the funeral. He wore his dress uniform and stood at the grave and didn't cry, and held his mother's arm and drove her home and sat in the garage alone and drank until he couldn't stand. Ruth sold the garage. She couldn't run it herself, and Marcus was in no condition to take it over. She sold it to a man named Kendrick, who turned it into an auto parts franchise, and she took the $47,000 and put it in a savings account and tried to keep living in a house that was too big for one old woman and one broken son. Marcus left. He didn't announce it. He didn't plan it. He woke up one morning in July 2011 and felt the walls of the house pressing in on him like the walls of a vehicle turned on its side in a ditch in Paktia province. And he put his duffel bag over his shoulder and walked out the front door and down Caldwell Road and kept walking. He didn't say goodbye to Ruth. He couldn't. Saying goodbye would have required looking at her, and looking at her would have meant seeing what he had done to her, the weight she had lost, the gray in her hair that hadn't been there 2 years ago, the way she jumped when a door closed because she was always waiting for the next terrible thing. He couldn't carry that. He was already carrying Gilroy and Janelle and Lily and his father's hand on the back of his neck and a bronze star he didn't deserve, and he couldn't carry his mother's grief on top of it. So he walked away. He told himself he was protecting her. Years later, he would understand that he was only protecting himself. He drifted. That is the word people use, drifted, and it sounds almost peaceful, like a boat on a calm lake. But the reality of drifting, when you are a 32-year-old combat veteran with untreated PTSD and a drinking problem, is not peaceful. It is a series of shelters with rules he couldn't follow, encampments under overpasses, with people whose damage was different from his, but equally consuming soup kitchen lines, where he stood with his eyes on the ground because he couldn't bear to look at the faces of the other men and see himself reflected. He moved east across Iowa, Harlan to Denison to Carroll, to Boone, to Ames, to Marshalltown to Waterloo, each town lasting a few weeks or a few months before something made him leave. Sometimes it was trouble, a fight with another homeless man over a sleeping spot, a run-in with police who told him to move along, a shelter that required sobriety he couldn't maintain. Sometimes it was nothing. Sometimes he just woke up and started walking, because staying still meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant Gilroy's eyes going empty and Lily's face when he yelled, and Janelle's note on the kitchen table, "I love you, I can't save you," and the weight of all that remembering was heavier than any rucksack he had ever carried up any mountain in any country where people were trying to kill him. He arrived in Cedar Falls in the late summer of 2014. He found the Ridgemont overpass by accident, walking along the railroad tracks that ran parallel to the river, looking for somewhere dry to sleep. And there it was, a wide, flat patch of ground between the concrete pylon and the fence, sheltered from wind on three sides, close enough to the river to hear the water, but far enough to avoid flooding, except in the worst spring rains. He set down his duffel and his sleeping bag and his tin coffee can, and he stayed. Not because he chose Cedar Falls, not because it was better than anywhere else, because he was too tired to keep walking. He was 35 years old. He weighed 153 pounds, down from 174 when he enlisted. His beard was long and unkempt, and his hands were calloused, and his left knee ached from an old injury that the VA had documented but never treated. He had not spoken to his mother in 3 years. He had not spoken to Janelle in 4. He had not seen his daughter since she was 2.5 years old, and she was now 6, almost 7, and he did not know what she looked like, or what her voice sounded like, or whether she asked about him. He assumed she didn't. He assumed Janelle had done the smart thing and erased him, the way you erase a mistake from a ledger, cleanly, completely, so the numbers make sense again. He set up his camp, and he learned the rhythms of the bridge, the way he had learned the rhythms of a fire base, who passed overhead and when, which cars slowed down, which joggers ran the path along the river at dawn. And every morning at 6:47, a woman in a dark green coat crossed the bridge above him with footsteps that clicked like a metronome, and Marcus lay on his cardboard and listened and thought, that is what a life sounds like. Her name was Catherine Aldridge, and she was 51 years old, and she was not the kind of person who stopped. Catherine had been walking across the Ridgemont overpass every weekday morning for 9 years, ever since she took the position as administrative director at the Cedar Falls Community Health Center on Parker Street, a 12-minute walk from her apartment on Sycamore. She was a tall woman, 5'10" in flat shoes, 5'11" in the low heels she wore to work. With short silver hair, she had stopped dyeing at 45 because she decided that vanity was a tax she was no longer willing to pay, and pale blue eyes that her late husband Martin had once described as the color of a lake just before a storm. Martin had been dead for 6 years, killed by a heart attack at 49 while mowing the lawn on a Saturday in August, and Catherine had processed that grief the way she processed everything, methodically, privately, and with an efficiency that sometimes alarmed the people who loved her. She had 2 grown children, a son, David, who lived in Minneapolis and called every Sunday, and a daughter, Sarah, who lived in Portland and called when she remembered, which was less often than Catherine wished, but more often than Catherine expected. Catherine was organized. Catherine was punctual. Catherine kept lists and followed through and did not leave things unfinished. She donated to 3 charities by automatic monthly withdrawal. She volunteered at the food bank on the second Saturday of every month. She recycled. She voted. She was, by every measurable standard, a good person. And she walked over Marcus Delane every single morning for 741 days and never looked down. She knew he was there. She could smell the campfire some mornings. He burned scrap wood in a pit he'd dug near the pylon when the temperature dropped, and she could see the faint glow of it in winter before dawn. She knew the way you know things you don't want to confront. Peripherally, in the part of your brain that files information under "not my problem," or someone else will handle it, or I wouldn't know what to do anyway. She was not cruel. She was not indifferent in the way that cruelty requires indifference. She was afraid. Not of Marcus specifically. She didn't know his name, didn't know he was a veteran, didn't know he had a bronze star and a tin coffee can 6 feet below the asphalt she walked on. She was afraid of the enormity of the problem he represented. One homeless man under one bridge was not one problem. It was 1,000 problems compressed into a single human shape. Mental health, addiction, veteran services, housing, family breakdown, systemic failure. And Catherine had spent her entire career in healthcare administration learning that you cannot solve 1,000 problems with a kind word and a sandwich. So she kept walking. She rationalized it. She told herself that there were agencies for this, professionals who knew how to help, that her involvement would be amateurish at best and harmful at worst. She told herself these things every morning for 2 years while her shoes clicked across the bridge at 6:47 and a man lay beneath her listening to the sound of her passage and wondering if she knew he existed. And then came November 14th. The temperature dropped to 9 degrees Fahrenheit overnight with a wind chill of -12. Catherine woke at 5:45 and checked her phone and saw the weather alert and put on an extra layer under her coat and wrapped a scarf around her neck and pulled on insulated gloves, and stepped outside into a cold so sharp it felt personal, as if the air itself had intentions. She walked her usual route, left on Sycamore, right on Division, across the parking lot of the closed hardware store, and onto the bridge. She was halfway across when she stopped. She didn't decide to stop. Her body stopped, her feet stopped moving, and she stood there in the howling wind, with her scarf pressed against her face, and she looked down over the railing, and she saw him. He was curled on his side on the cardboard inside the sleeping bag, and he wasn't moving. The fire pit was dark. No embers, no glow, nothing. His duffel bag was next to him, and his tin coffee can was next to the duffel, and there was frost on the sleeping bag, a thin white crust that caught the light from the street lamp on the far side of the bridge. Catherine stood there for 7 seconds. She counted them later when she told the story because she wanted to be honest about the fact that for 7 seconds she considered walking away. 7 seconds of I'm going to be late, of he's probably fine, of someone else will, of I don't know what to do. 7 seconds. And then she walked to the end of the bridge and down the embankment, her heels sliding on the frozen grass, her briefcase banging against her hip. And she stood 10 feet from the sleeping bag and said, in a voice that was louder than she intended, because the wind was fierce, "Are you alive?" Marcus opened his eyes. He looked at her. His face was red and raw from the cold, and his lips were cracked, and his beard was crusted with ice, and he looked at this tall woman in a green coat, standing on the frozen ground in heels and holding a briefcase, and he said, "That depends on your definition." Catherine did not laugh. She did not smile. She said, "Can you stand up?" He said, "I think so." She said, "Then stand up. I'm taking you somewhere warm." He said, "Why?" And Catherine Aldridge, who had walked over this man for 741 days, who had filed him under not my problem, who had rationalized her avoidance with the language of systemic complexity and professional boundaries, said the truest thing she had said in years, because I should have stopped 2 years ago. She said it without drama. She said it the way you state a fact that has been obvious to everyone, except the person stating it. Marcus looked at her for a long time, long enough that the wind pushed tears from his eyes that might have been cold or might have been something else. And then he stood up. He was unsteady. His left knee buckled, and he caught himself on the pylon and straightened, and he was taller than she expected, even hunched, even diminished. And she could see, in the set of his shoulders, in the way he stood, even when standing cost him something, that this man had once been someone who stood straight. She walked him to the health center. It was a 12-minute walk, and it took them 28 minutes, because Marcus moved slowly and Catherine matched his pace. She didn't hold his arm. She didn't try to make conversation. She walked beside him in silence, and the only sound was the wind and their footsteps. His heavy and shuffling, hers still clicking, but slower now, so much slower than the 741 mornings before. The Cedar Falls Community Health Center was a single-story brick building with a waiting room that smelled like hand sanitizer and old magazines. And when Catherine walked through the front door with Marcus Delane beside her at 7:22 a.m., 15 minutes before the center officially opened. Her receptionist, a young woman named Danielle, looked up from her computer and her eyes went wide, and Catherine said, "This is..." And then she stopped because she didn't know his name. She turned to him and said, "I don't know your name." "Marcus," he said. "Just Marcus." Catherine nodded and turned back to Danielle and said, "This is Marcus. He needs to see Dr. Reeves. He needs a warm room, something to eat, and a blanket in that order." Danielle, to her credit, did not ask questions. She brought a blanket from the supply closet and a granola bar from her desk drawer and showed Marcus to an exam room with a chair that reclined and a heating vent that blew directly on it. And Marcus sat down and pulled the blanket around his shoulders and ate the granola bar in 4 bites and closed his eyes. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt the absence of cold. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the absence of the thing that had been trying to kill him. And that absence was so overwhelming that his hands started shaking and he couldn't make them stop. Dr. Alan Reeves arrived at 7:45, and Catherine intercepted him at the door and spoke to him in a low voice for 90 seconds. And Dr. Reeves, a man in his early 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and the particular patience of someone who had practiced medicine in an underserved community for 30 years, went into the exam room and closed the door and didn't come out for 2 hours and 15 minutes. When he emerged, he found Catherine sitting in the hallway in a plastic chair with her coat still on and her briefcase on her lap. She had missed a staff meeting. She hadn't noticed. Dr. Reeves sat in the chair next to her and said, "He's a veteran, 2 tours in Afghanistan. He has untreated PTSD, moderate frostbite on 3 toes of his left foot, possible early-stage liver damage, malnutrition, and a knee injury that should have been surgically repaired years ago. He's been living under that bridge for over 2 years. Catherine said, "I know." Dr. Reeves looked at her and said, "You knew?" She said, "I knew he was there. I didn't know who he was. There's a difference." And then she was quiet for a moment and said, "No, there isn't." Dr. Reeves didn't push it. He told her what Marcus needed: medical treatment, psychiatric evaluation, substance abuse counseling, VA enrollment, housing. And Catherine wrote it all down on the back of a staff meeting agenda because she didn't have paper, and she was a woman who made lists. She made a list, and then she started calling. Catherine Aldridge was not a social worker. She was not a therapist. She was not a veterans advocate. She was a healthcare administrator who was very, very good at navigating bureaucratic systems. And in the weeks that followed, she applied that skill to Marcus Delane's life with the same methodical intensity she applied to everything. She called the VA in Iowa City, waited on hold for 47 minutes, was transferred 3 times, and finally reached a case coordinator named Williams, who said that Marcus was technically still in their system, that his file had been flagged as inactive, and that he was eligible for benefits he had never claimed. She drove Marcus to the VA hospital in Iowa City, a 90-mile drive each way, 4 times in 3 weeks. She sat in waiting rooms with her laptop, answering work emails while Marcus sat in offices and answered questions about his service, his discharge, his medical history, his drinking, his family, his nightmares. She did not ask to be in the room with him. She waited outside. She understood, with the instinct of someone who had raised 2 children and buried a husband, that there are doors a person has to walk through alone. But she was there when he came out, and she drove him home. And home was temporarily a room at the Sunrise Motel on Route 218 that Catherine paid for out of her own pocket at $49 a night for 23 nights until the VA temporary housing came through. She told no one at work what she was doing, but she told David and Sarah, and David said, "Mom, be careful." And Sarah said, "Mom, that's amazing." And Catherine said, "It's not amazing. It's overdue." Marcus didn't trust her, not at first, not for weeks. He sat in the motel room and watched television and waited for the other shoe to drop, for the conditions, the expectations, the moment when she would reveal what she wanted from him. He had learned in 3 years on the streets that nothing was free, that kindness was usually a down payment on something else, and that the people who helped you were usually helping themselves feel better about a world they had done nothing to fix. He told Catherine this. Not in those words. Marcus was not a man who articulated his emotional landscape with precision, but in the way he held himself when she brought groceries, in the way he flinched when she knocked on the motel door, in the way he said, "Thank you," with his eyes on the floor, as if gratitude were a form of surrender. Catherine noticed all of it and didn't address any of it directly. She just kept showing up. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, after work, with groceries or a sandwich, or forms that needed signing or a ride to an appointment. She didn't ask about his past. She didn't ask about his family. She didn't ask him to be grateful or recovered or hopeful. She asked him if he needed anything from the store. She asked him if his knee was hurting. She asked him if the heater in the room was working. She asked small questions because she understood that small questions were the foundation on which trust was built, one ordinary interaction at a time, and that large questions, "Who are you? What happened to you? Why are you here?" were the kind of questions that made broken people retreat into the walls they'd spent years constructing. The VA came through in mid-December with transitional housing, a small apartment in a veterans housing complex in Waterloo, 18 miles from Cedar Falls, with a bed and a kitchenette and a window that looked out on a parking lot. It was not beautiful. It was 4 walls and a roof and a lock on the door. And when Marcus turned the key for the first time and stepped inside and set his duffel on the bed, he stood in the middle of the room and pressed his hands against the wall and felt its solidity, and something broke inside him. Not the sharp break of crisis, but the slow break of thawing, the cracking of ice that has been frozen for so long that the water beneath it has forgotten it was ever liquid. He cried. He hadn't cried since his father's funeral. He cried the way a man cries who has spent 3 years convincing himself he is not a person. Ugly, shaking, loud sobs that came from somewhere beneath his ribs and sounded like they were tearing things loose on the way out. Catherine wasn't there for that. She heard about it later from Williams at the VA, who called her because Marcus had listed her as his emergency contact, the only phone number he had. And Williams said, "I thought you should know. He's settling in. He had a rough first night, but he's settling in." Catherine said, "Good." And then she hung up and sat in her kitchen and put her hands over her face and cried too, because she was thinking about 741 mornings and the sound of her own footsteps and the person she had been before November 14th and the person she was becoming now, and the distance between those two people felt both immense and terrifyingly small. Marcus started treatment. The VA assigned him a psychiatrist, Dr. Nora Okafor, a woman in her 40s with short dreadlocks and a directness that Marcus found simultaneously unsettling and reassuring. She didn't tiptoe. She didn't use soft language. She said, "You have PTSD, and you've been self-medicating with alcohol for over a decade, and you've been living in survival mode so long that you've forgotten what living actually feels like. We're going to work on that. It's going to be hard and slow, and you're going to want to quit. Don't." Marcus stared at her and said, "You remind me of my sergeant." She said, "Good. That means you'll listen." He started medication, carefully, monitored, adjusted over weeks until the dosage was right. He started therapy, twice a week, then once a week, then once every 2 weeks as the months passed. He started AA meetings at a church basement in Waterloo on Tuesday and Thursday nights, where he sat in a folding metal chair and drank bad coffee and listened to other men tell stories that sounded like his story. And for the first time in years, he understood that his wreckage was not unique. It was common. It was almost ordinary, in the way that suffering is always ordinary when you zoom out far enough to see the full landscape of human damage. He got sober, not easily, not linearly. He relapsed twice in the first 4 months. Once, after a nightmare about Gilroy that was so vivid, he woke up tasting dust. And once, on the anniversary of his father's death, when the grief hit him like a wave he hadn't seen coming. Both times he called Catherine instead of walking to the liquor store. The first time she answered on the second ring and said, "What do you need?" And he said, "I need someone to tell me not to drink." And she said, "Don't drink. Come to my apartment. I'll make coffee." And he went. The second time she didn't answer, she was at a dentist appointment, and he called Williams at the VA, and Williams talked to him for 45 minutes until the urge passed. He got a job in June 2015. Part-time, stocking shelves at a hardware store on Logan Avenue, minimum wage, 16 hours a week. It was not glamorous. It was not the career his mother had imagined for him or the life his father had hoped for when he said, "You come home." But it was a paycheck with his name on it, and the first time he cashed it, $143.72 after taxes, He folded the bills into his wallet and felt them against his thigh as he walked home and thought, I earned this, not found it, not begged for it, earned it. The feeling was so foreign that it took him several blocks to identify it. It was dignity, that was the word, dignity. He hadn't felt it in so long that he had forgotten its texture, and now here it was, pressing against his thigh in the form of 6 20s, a 10, a 5, 3 ones, and 72 cents. He increased his hours. 16 became 24. 24 became 32. His manager, a woman named Trish, who had a blonde ponytail and a voice that could project across the entire store, told him he was dependable and asked if he wanted to learn the register. He learned the register. He learned inventory management. He learned the difference between 47 types of screws, and the knowledge felt like the parts of a car: alternator, distributor cap, timing belt, something solid and knowable in a world that had been neither. Catherine kept coming. Wednesdays now for dinner at his apartment in Waterloo. She brought food, or he cooked. He was learning to cook, following recipes from a book she had given him, starting with things that were hard to ruin: spaghetti, chili, scrambled eggs. They talked, not about Afghanistan, not at first, about weather, about work, about the news, about Catherine's children, David's promotion, Sarah's new apartment, about Martin, her husband, who had died mowing a lawn on a Saturday in August. About the way grief doesn't get smaller, Catherine said. It just gets more familiar, like a piece of furniture you learn to walk around in the dark. Marcus listened. He was still a listener, still the quiet kid who watched more than he spoke. But the quality of his listening had changed. Before, his silence had been a wall. Now it was a window. He was letting things in. And one Wednesday in September 2015, over a pot of chili that was slightly too salty, he told Catherine about Gilroy. He told her about the dust and the heat and the sound of the IED, and the way Gilroy's eyes went from afraid to confused to empty, and about the marigolds in the brake fluid and the things he said to a dying boy to try to make the dying less terrifying, and about how none of it worked, how Gilroy died anyway and Marcus set him down and picked up his rifle and kept fighting because that is what soldiers do, and how he had been setting Gilroy down and picking up his rifle every single day since then, over and over, in his sleep and in his waking hours, and how he was so tired of fighting that sometimes the bridge, not the one he slept under, but a different kind of bridge, a metaphorical one, seemed like the only way to stop. Catherine put down her spoon. She looked at him across the table in the small kitchen of the small apartment in the Veterans Housing Complex with the window that looked out on the parking lot, and she said very quietly, "I'm glad you didn't cross that bridge." Marcus looked at her, and for a long time, neither of them spoke, and the chili cooled, and the kitchen was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator. And then Marcus said, "Me too." And he meant it. For the first time, he meant it. In the spring of 2016, Marcus told Dr. Okafor that he wanted to find his daughter. He said it during a session in March on a Tuesday, sitting in the leather chair across from her desk. And he said it the way he said most important things, without preamble, without build-up, as a simple statement of fact dropped into the middle of a conversation about something else. "I want to find Lily." Dr. Okafor set down her pen and looked at him and said, "Tell me what you're hoping for." He said, "I don't know. I want to see her. I want her to know I'm alive. I want..." He paused, and the pause lasted long enough that Dr. Okafor waited. "I want her to know I didn't leave because of her." Dr. Okafor said, "What are you afraid of?" He said, "Everything. That she hates me. That she doesn't remember me. That Janelle told her I'm dead. That she's better off without me, and finding her would be selfish. That I'm doing this for me, and not for her." Dr. Okafor said, "Some of those fears might be justified. Some of them might not. You won't know until you try. But I need you to understand something, Marcus. You can't control how she responds. You can only control what you bring. So what are you bringing?" He thought about it for a week. He thought about it while stocking shelves and running the register and cooking spaghetti and going to AA meetings and sitting in his apartment watching the parking lot through the window. And the following Tuesday, he sat in Dr. Okafor's chair and said, "I'm bringing the truth. That's all I have." Finding Janelle was not difficult. She had not disappeared. She had not changed her name. She was living in Council Bluffs, where she had gone when she left Marcus in 2010, and she was working as a registered nurse at Jenny Edmondson Hospital, and she was not remarried, and Lily was 8 years old and in the 3rd grade. Marcus found all of this through a simple internet search at the Cedar Falls Public Library, sitting at a computer with his hands trembling, and it struck him, the absurd, almost offensive simplicity of it, that the family he had lost was a Google search away, that he could have found them at any point in 6 years, that the distance between them had never been geographical. Catherine offered to come with him. He said no. This was a door he had to walk through alone. He drove to Council Bluffs on a Saturday in April 2016, borrowed Catherine's car, a gray Toyota Camry, that still had Martin's fishing hat in the back seat, and he pulled up in front of a small white house on Avenue G with a chain-link fence and a swing set in the backyard, and he sat in the car for 42 minutes before he could make himself get out. The house was neat. The yard was mowed. There were tulips along the walkway, red and yellow, and a welcome mat at the front door, and through the window, he could see a television playing something animated and colorful, and the ordinariness of it, the sheer devastating normalcy, almost undid him. He rang the doorbell. He heard footsteps. The door opened. Janelle stood there. She was 33 now, and she looked different, thinner in the face, her hair shorter, lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when she was 26. But she was unmistakably Janelle, the woman who had pressed her hand against his chest in the dark and said his name until the screaming stopped. She looked at him. Her face went through a sequence of expressions so rapid and so contradictory that it was like watching weather, recognition, shock, fear, anger, grief, something softer than grief that didn't have a name. And then she said, "Oh God, Marcus." She didn't invite him in right away. She stepped outside and closed the door behind her, and they stood on the porch, two people who had once shared a bed and a child and a kitchen table with a note on it, and Janelle said, "Are you sober?" He said, "Yes." 14 months. She said, "Are you getting help?" He said, "Yes. VA, therapy, medication, AA, all of it." She said, "Where have you been?" And he told her. Not everything, not the worst of it, not the nights under the bridge, not the cold that had almost killed him, but enough. The shelters, the drifting, the drinking, the day a woman in a green coat stopped on a bridge. Janelle listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "I need to tell you something." Marcus waited. She said, "Lily asks about you. She asks why her daddy left, and I have never known what to tell her. I don't tell her you're dead. I don't tell her you're a bad person. I tell her that you got sick in a way that's hard to see, and that you're trying to get better, and that you love her. I've been telling her that for 6 years, and I don't know if it's true, but I need it to be true, Marcus. I need it to be true." Marcus felt something in his throat that made it difficult to speak, and he said, "It's true." She let him in. The house was small and warm and smelled like laundry detergent and something baking. Cookies, he thought. And there were photographs on the refrigerator and a backpack by the door and shoes by the mat and all the artifacts of a life he should have been part of. And then a door opened down the hall and a girl appeared, small for 8, with dark hair and 2 braids and enormous brown eyes and bare feet on the hallway floor. And she looked at the tall stranger in her living room, and she didn't speak. Marcus looked at his daughter. He hadn't seen her since she was 2.5 years old. She had been a baby when he'd held her last, a warm weight in his arms who smelled like baby shampoo and made sounds that weren't words yet. Now she was a child, a person with braids and bare feet and eyes that were looking at him with a curiosity that was unbearable in its openness because it carried no judgment, no anger, just the pure, devastating question of a child encountering someone new. Janelle said, "Lily, this is..." And she paused, and in that pause, Marcus could feel the weight of 6 years, of every night Janelle had lain awake wondering what to say, of every question Lily had asked that Janelle had answered with a version of the truth that was both honest and incomplete. "This is your dad." Lily looked at him. She looked at her mother. She looked at him again. And then she said, in a voice that was small but not timid, "Are you better now?" Marcus knelt down so he was at her level. His left knee screamed. He ignored it. He looked into his daughter's eyes. her mother's dark hair, his own watchful gaze, and he said, "I'm getting better. It takes a long time, but I'm getting better." Lily considered this with the gravity of a child who has been thinking about this conversation for longer than any child should have to think about anything. Then she said, "Okay, do you want to see my room? I have a fish." Marcus looked up at Janelle. Janelle's eyes were full of tears, and her arms were crossed over her chest, and she nodded once. And Marcus stood up and followed his daughter down the hallway to a small bedroom with purple walls and a bookshelf and a tank with a single goldfish swimming in circles. And Lily said, "His name is Captain." And Marcus said, "That's a good name." And Lily said, "I named him that because captains are brave." And Marcus felt the ice breaking again, the slow, agonizing thaw. And he said, "Yes, they are." The rebuilding was slow. It was supposed to be slow. Dr. Okafor had told him to expect that, and Catherine had told him, and Williams at the VA had told him, and everyone was right. But knowing something is slow doesn't make the slowness easier to bear. Marcus visited Lily every other Saturday. Janelle set the boundary, and Marcus respected it because respecting boundaries was something he was learning to do, and because he understood, with the hard-won clarity of a man who had spent years destroying trust, that trust is rebuilt in millimeters, not miles. He and Lily did small things. They went to the park. They went to the library. They got ice cream at a place on Broadway that had 32 flavors, and Lily always got strawberry because she said it was the most honest flavor. And Marcus didn't know what that meant, but he agreed because anything Lily said sounded like the truth. He told her stories, not about Afghanistan, never about that, but about his father's garage and the names of car parts and his mother's marigolds and the way Ruth's garden smelled in July. Lily listened the way Marcus listened, completely, with her whole body leaning toward the sound of his voice. And sometimes she asked questions that were so precise they felt surgical. "Why did you go away? Did you miss me when you were away? Were you scared?" He answered, "Everyone." He didn't lie. He didn't soften. He said, "I went away because I was sick, and I didn't know how to get better, and I was afraid of hurting you. I missed you every single day. I was scared all the time." Lily took these answers and processed them with a seriousness that made Marcus's chest ache. And then she moved on, the way children do, with a resilience that is not indifference, but rather a profound, instinctive understanding that the present moment is the only one that matters. He called his mother. That was harder. He sat in his apartment in Waterloo on a Sunday evening in May 2016 and dialed the number of the house on Caldwell Road and listened to it ring 4 times and heard his mother's voice, older, thinner, uncertain. "Say hello?" And he said, "Mom, it's Marcus." The silence lasted 11 seconds. He counted. Then Ruth Delane made a sound that was not a word, a raw, involuntary exhalation that contained 5 years of grief and terror, and prayers spoken to an empty room, and calls to hospitals and police departments and morgues, always the morgues, always the question that no mother should ever have to ask. "Is my son there? Is he dead? Have you found his body?" "Marcus," she said. "Marcus. Baby. Where are you?" He told her. She cried. He cried. They cried together across 200 miles of Iowa farmland and telephone wire, and when they were done, Ruth said, "You come home. You come home right now." And Marcus heard his father's voice in hers. "You come home. That's the only order I'm giving you." And he said, "I will, Mom. I will. Not yet, but I will." He visited her in June. He drove Catherine's Camry to Harlan and pulled up in front of the house on Caldwell Road, and it looked smaller than he remembered, the way childhood places always do, and the garden was overgrown. Ruth couldn't keep it up alone. Her knees were bad, her back hurt. She was 67, and she moved like she was 80. And the garage was gone, replaced by the auto parts franchise with its bright sign and corporate logo. And the driveway where James had hugged him for 11 seconds was cracked and weedy. Ruth came out the front door. She was small. Had she always been that small? Sherry, and her hair was white, and her housecoat was faded, and she moved slowly, one hand on the railing. And when she reached the bottom step, she stopped and looked at her son standing in the driveway, and her face did the thing that faces do when the body cannot contain what the heart is feeling. It crumpled, collapsed inward, every muscle surrendering to the weight of a love that had been carrying grief for 5 years without setting it down. Marcus walked to her and put his arms around her, and she was so small, so light, that he was afraid he would break her, and she pressed her face against his chest and she said, "I thought you were dead. I thought you were dead, and I would never know." He held her. He held her the way he had held Gilroy, not that way, not that way, but with the same desperate tenderness, the same understanding that the person in his arms was fragile and precious, and that he had almost lost them, except this time the loss would have been his fault, entirely and irrevocably his fault. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. "I'm so sorry." She pulled back and looked up at him, and her eyes were red and swollen and fierce. Ruth Delane's eyes were always fierce, even when they were drowning. And she said, don't you ever disappear again. Do you hear me?" He heard her. Marcus moved back to the Cedar Falls area permanently in the fall of 2016. The VA helped him transfer to a one-bedroom apartment in a housing complex in Waterloo that was closer to his treatment and his AA group and his job, which had become full-time by then. 40 hours a week at the hardware store, $12.50 an hour, with health insurance and a week of paid vacation that he used to visit Lily in Council Bluffs. He was 37 years old. He had been sober for 2 years. He had a daughter who knew his name, and a mother who knew his address, and a friend who brought over chili on Wednesdays, and a psychiatrist who told him he was doing the work, and a sponsor at AA named Gerald, who had been sober for 19 years, and who told Marcus that every sober day was a middle finger to the darkness, which was not clinical language but was effective. He was not healed. He wanted to be clear about that. He told Catherine, he told Dr. Okafor, he told Gerald, "I am not healed. I still have nightmares. I still can't sit with my back to a door. I still hear Gilroy's breathing when the room gets too quiet. But I am here, and that is not nothing." Catherine corrected him. "That is not nothing," she repeated. "That is everything, Marcus. That is the whole point." In the spring of 2017, Marcus went back to the Ridgemont overpass. He hadn't been back since the morning Catherine found him, and he didn't go for sentimental reasons. He went because his therapist suggested it, because Dr. Okafor said that sometimes returning to a place where you suffered can help you understand how far you've come, and because Marcus was a man who did what his sergeant told him to do, and Dr. Okafor was his sergeant now. He went on a Saturday morning in April, early, when the light was thin and golden and the river was high from spring rain. He walked down the embankment and stood where his cardboard had been and looked at the concrete pylon and the chain-link fence and the fire pit, which was still there, a shallow depression in the dirt with a ring of blackened stones. Someone else had been sleeping there. There was a blanket and a flattened box and an empty bottle. Marcus looked at the blanket and the box and the bottle, and he thought about the man who had put them there, and he thought about himself 2.5 years ago, and he thought about Catherine's footsteps overhead and the 7 seconds she stood on the bridge, deciding whether to come down. And he understood, standing there in the golden light with the river running and the birds starting to wake, that his life had turned on those 7 seconds. That everything, the apartment, the job, the sobriety, Lily's braids and her goldfish, named Captain, and Ruth's fierce eyes, and the chili on Wednesdays, all of it existed because one person decided after 741 days of walking past to stop. He didn't stay long. He stood there for a few minutes, and then he walked back up the embankment and across the bridge, and he listened to his own footsteps on the asphalt, and they sounded different now. They sounded like they were going somewhere. He continued to build. He got his knee repaired, finally, after 15 years of compensating for the injury, and spent 6 weeks in physical therapy, and came out walking straighter than he had walked since Afghanistan. He started volunteering at the Cedar Valley Veterans Outreach Center, first 1 afternoon a week, then 2, then 3, talking to homeless veterans and veterans in crisis, and veterans who sat in plastic chairs in church basements with their hands shaking around cups of bad coffee, and he told them his story. Not the sanitized version, not the redemption arc with the inspiring music, but the real version, the ugly version, the I lived under a bridge for 2 years and almost died version. And he watched their faces and saw the thing that he had seen in his own face in the mirror of a gas station bathroom at 3 a.m. The exhausted, desperate hope that maybe, if this man survived, I can too. Janelle didn't take him back. They didn't reconcile romantically. That story, the love story, the reunion, the family restored, was a story for movies. and this was not a movie. This was two people who had loved each other and damaged each other, and who now had to figure out how to be parents together without being partners. They managed. They communicated through text messages and phone calls that were civil and sometimes warm and occasionally tense, and they put Lily at the center of every decision. And Lily, who was 9 and then 10 and then 11, and growing taller and fiercer and more certain of herself with every month, navigated the complexity of her family with a grace that astonished both of her parents. She started spending 1 weekend a month with Marcus, then 2. She met Catherine and immediately loved her, the way children love adults who are honest and competent and who treat them like full human beings rather than fragile decorations. Catherine taught Lily to make chili. Lily taught Catherine the names of car parts: alternator, distributor cap, timing belt. Marcus sat at the table and watched his daughter and his friend and felt the crack in the ice widen, not into chaos, not into the flood he had always feared, but into a river, running, alive, full. In December 2019, Marcus went to see Ruth in Harlan. He went alone, no Catherine, no Lily, just himself and the gray Camry, which he had bought from Catherine for $3,200 when she got a new car, paying in installments of $200 a month. He pulled into the driveway of the house on Caldwell Road and found Ruth in the kitchen, thinner now, slower, but still cooking. Always cooking, even when there was no one to cook for but herself. She had made meatloaf. Monday. Marcus smiled when he saw it, and Ruth saw the smile and said, "Don't get sentimental on me. I make this every Monday." And Marcus said, "I know, Mom." She had something to show him. She led him to the backyard, moving carefully across the frozen grass, and pointed to the garden. It was winter bare, just brown earth and the stubble of last season's plants. But the marigold bed was visible, a long strip of dark soil along the fence, and Ruth said, "I replanted them this year, all of them. Same variety your father said didn't keep the bugs away." She looked at Marcus and her eyes were bright and fierce and wet. "They don't keep the bugs away," she said. "They never did. I plant them because they're beautiful and because your father was wrong, and I loved him anyway." Marcus stood in the frozen garden with his mother and looked at the bare earth where the marigolds would bloom in spring, orange and gold and stubborn and pointless and beautiful. And he thought about James's hand on the back of his neck, and Janelle's hand on his chest in the dark, and Catherine's voice saying, "Because I should have stopped 2 years ago," and Lily asking, "Are you better now?" and Dr. Okafor saying, "Don't quit," and Gerald saying every sober day is a middle finger to the darkness, and Ruth planting flowers that didn't work because she loved the man who said they didn't work, and all of it, every hand, every voice, every stubborn refusal to stop caring, was the same thing. It was the same thing. It was people choosing over and over to stop on the bridge. Marcus Delane is 45 years old now. He works full-time as a peer support specialist at the Cedar Valley Veterans Outreach Center, helping homeless and at-risk veterans access services, find housing, and navigate the Byzantine labyrinth of the VA system. He makes $38,000 a year. He has been sober for 9 years. He lives in a 2-bedroom apartment in Cedar Falls. The second bedroom is Lily's. For the weekends she stays with him, which is most of them now that she is 16, and has her own opinions about where she wants to be. She is tall, like her mother. She is quiet, like her father. She is fierce, like her grandmother. She is considering nursing school, which makes Janelle proud, and Marcus terrified because he doesn't want his daughter to carry other people's pain. But he knows that the capacity to carry pain is not a weakness. It is the thing that makes the carrying bearable for the person being carried. Catherine Aldridge retired from the health center in 2022. She is 61 years old, and she spends her time volunteering and visiting her grandchild, David's son, born in 2021, a boy named Martin, after the husband who died mowing a lawn on a Saturday in August. She and Marcus still have dinner on Wednesdays. The chili is better now. Marcus has perfected the recipe. Ruth is 80 years old. She still lives in the house on Caldwell Road. She still plants marigolds every spring. She still makes meatloaf on Mondays. Marcus drives to see her twice a month, and when he pulls into the driveway, she comes to the door and watches him walk up the path, and she never says anything until he is close enough to touch, and then she puts her hand on his arm and says, "There you are," as if she has been waiting, as if she has always been waiting. Marcus still has nightmares. Not every night, not like before, but some nights, the anniversaries, the bad nights, the nights when the wind sounds like something he can't name. He wakes up and the room is dark, and for a moment, he doesn't know where he is. And for a moment, he is back under the bridge, or back in the dust, or back in the ditch, holding a boy named Gilroy who is dying in his arms. And then he breathes. And then he reaches for the phone on the nightstand. And then he doesn't call anyone. He doesn't need to. He just holds the phone and feels its weight and thinks about the people who would answer if he did call. Catherine, Janelle, Ruth, Gerald, Dr. Okafor, Williams at the VA. Lily, who is 16, and sleeping in the next room with a goldfish named Captain 2 because Captain 1 lived a good long life, but goldfish are not immortal. He thinks about all of them, and he sets the phone down, and he lies in the dark, and he listens to the quiet. Not the empty quiet of the bridge, the full quiet. The quiet of a room where you are safe. The quiet of a place where someone knows you are there. He doesn't sleep right away. Sometimes he lies awake for an hour or two, and in those hours, he thinks about a woman in a green coat standing on a bridge for 7 seconds, deciding. 7 seconds. That's all it was. 7 seconds between walking past and walking down. 7 seconds between not my problem and because I should have stopped 2 years ago. 7 seconds between the life he was living and the life he lives now. If you are watching this right now, if you are the person under the bridge or the person walking over it, I want you to hear what Marcus Delane learned in the 741 days between the first footstep and the last, and in all the years that followed. The person under the bridge cannot always call for help. The weight of shame and damage and silence is too heavy. Sometimes the person under the bridge has forgotten that they are a person at all. They have been invisible so long that they have started to believe their own invisibility. They cannot stop you. They cannot make you look down. That part is yours. The stopping is always yours. And the person on the bridge, the one who walks past every day, who knows and doesn't look, who rationalizes the not looking with words like systemic and professional and someone else, that person is not evil. They are afraid. They are afraid of the enormity of a problem they cannot solve. They are afraid that their small, imperfect, amateurish act of kindness will not be enough. And they are right. It will not be enough. It will not fix everything. It will not undo the war or the addiction or the years of sleeping on cardboard in 9-degree weather. It will be insufficient and awkward and incomplete, and it will not solve the 1,000 problems compressed into a single human shape lying beneath the asphalt. But it will be something. And something, as Marcus Delane can tell you, standing in his kitchen in his 2-bedroom apartment in Cedar Falls, Iowa, stirring a pot of chili on a Wednesday evening while his daughter does homework at the table and a woman in a green coat hangs her coat by the door. Something is not nothing. Something is everything. Something is the whole point.